Welcome back. This week we're going to talk about, or I guess this session, we're going to talk about planning training cycles, as you can see. So hopefully you'll recall that in the last unit, or the last lecture, which was chapter 6, we talked about designing individual workouts as kind of the basis of that chapter. And so in this chapter, chapter 7, we move on to designing or planning training cycles. So we're going to talk mostly about microcycles, which are 1 week of training. And then we'll touch on macrocycles a little bit, which again for BAMPA, those are 2 to 6 weeks of training. And then in chapter 8, we move on to the annual training plan. So we kind of build our way up from what are you going to do in one workout to what are you going to do over the course of a week or 6 weeks to what are you going to do over the course of the whole year, which is an interesting setup from the perspective of that when you're designing an actual plan, you go the other way. So you actually start with what the year is going to look like, then you break it down into months or macrocycles and weeks, and then individual workouts, but that's all right. So the good news is this chapter should be pretty short because there's not a ton of new stuff here, and actually a lot of the concepts follow on to what we talked about, well, things we've talked about previously, but more specifically what we talked about with planning individual workouts, because that's often kind of the way that you're going to plan the actual training week or the microcycle. So as you can see there, there's 4 basic variants of the microcycle. The first is a developmental microcycle, and so we typically see those during the preparatory phase. So if you're doing a developmental microcycle, what you're trying to do is to develop some sort of an ability, right? So that might be one of those biomotor abilities, to use their terminology. So that might be muscular strength, endurance, power, agility, that kind of stuff. Or you could be intending to improve tactical, so strategy, or technical skills, right? So that them being able to actually do the movements of their sport, do the things they need to do, like serving or swimming strokes or perfecting the rowing stroke, whatever it is that they do, right? So that's a developmental microcycle. So we're trying to improve some ability, whether that's a biomotor ability, tactical, technical, etc. And then in a competition microcycle, what we're really trying to do there is trying to maintain. Because remember, through our previous discussions, one of the things that we've talked about is that over the course of, if you're thinking about a sport that has a competitive season as opposed to like an individual event or a couple of events, over the course of a competitive season in sports like football, basketball, baseball, etc., what you're really trying to do is to not lose muscular strength, not lose muscular power, endurance, that kind of stuff. So you're trying to not reduce those biomotor abilities, trying to hang on to the gains that you've made. And so that's the idea of a competition microcycle, is trying to hang on to the gains that you made during those developmental microcycles during the preparatory phase of your periodized program. The other 2 on there, so there's a recovery regeneration microcycle. Obviously that's a rest microcycle, but in that one, we typically see a reduction in both the load and the intensity. So they're not working as hard, and then they're not working as much. And I said load and intensity, I meant volume and intensity, sorry. So we typically see a reduction in both volume and intensity. I meant load from the standpoint of load as an additive of volume, intensity, frequency, all that stuff. So in a recovery regeneration microcycle, then you see a reduction in overall load, but as part of that reduction in load, you see a reduction in volume and intensity of training. And so typically we see those at the end of different phases. So for example, at the end of the preparatory phase, you might see a recovery or regeneration microcycle. The idea there is to dissipate fatigue, so to let them rest a little bit. And you might even go so far as to change training modes some. So for example, if you have a runner, during a recovery microcycle, maybe you have them spend a week doing like deep water running. Maybe they're doing bicycle, stair mill, whatever. I mean, stair mill is probably not something they're realistically going to do, but maybe, I don't know, low impact. So do a different modality that's not, the impact of running during that time, but still allows them to hang on to some of the adaptations that they've made. So for example, if they're, an endurance athlete like a distance runner, they've got an increase in blood volume, they've got an increase in stroke volume of the left ventricle, they have a more elastic, more extensible, thicker left ventricle wall. And so if we do a similar type of modality, like cycling or swimming for our runner, they're going to be able to hang on to most of those adaptations, not all of them, but it allows them to get away from running for a little bit. And you could do the same kind of thing, with your swimmers, they could run or bike. You could kind of move the aerobic exercises around. So that would be one way to do a recovery or regeneration microcycle. And then the last one there, the peaking or unloading microcycle. The key thing there is that you are going to maintain the intensity of the program. So they're still moving fast, they're still lifting heavy weight, but you're reducing the volume somewhere in the neighborhood of 50%. So this book gives out multiple numbers, but typically the range that they give is it's a reduction in volume somewhere between 40 and 60% during a peaking or taper or unloading microcycle. And so there you usually have two strung back to back, and the idea there is that we're going to do some sort of overreaching right up to that. So maybe we do some of that flat loading that we've talked about previously, where they're doing high volume, high intensity at the same time. And then we keep the intensity pretty high. Maybe we reduce it by 5 to 10%, but then we reduce the volume, maybe by 25% or 40% the first week, and then 50% the second. And then potentially you could even do like 3 weeks. That might be a little too long of a deload of a taper, but potentially you could do as many as like 3 weeks or 3 microcycles. So in terms of actually structuring the microcycle, so the weekly workouts, and so as I was saying workouts, one of the things I'm going to try to convey to you as we go through this talk is that if we're talking about somebody having or athletes having multiple sessions per day, keep in mind that things like film study, if an athlete does that in the morning and then comes back and actually does their workout in the afternoon, film study would actually count as a session, right? So that's still somewhat mentally fatiguing. It's not going to be fatiguing to the same extent that like wind sprints are, but there's still some mental energy that goes into that, and that's still a place that they got to be in the film room at a certain time, got to be paying attention. So that's still mentally taxing. So that would be part of our planning for the training week, and we'll talk about that more as we go along. But obviously, the way you structure that training week or that microcycle is dependent upon whatever the goal is. So if the primary goal is that they learn new tactics or new technique, as you'll see here, typically the way that we develop the weekly plan is it's going to be similar to what we talked about with designing an individual workout. So if you're doing or teaching new technique, teaching new tactics, you want to start the week with that. You want the athlete to be as fresh as possible, to have reduced fatigue as much as possible, and then have them go into learning new information, to learning new techniques, that kind of stuff. From there, we can work on development of speed. Strength, as you can see, fits in third, because if they're still too sore from a previous strength workout, they're not going to be able to do as well on the speed and power type training. So strength comes after that speed or agility training, and then the specific endurance, same thing. Those tend to be really pretty fatiguing type workouts. A lot of running or skating, rowing, etc. during those, and so those tend to be pretty both physically and mentally fatiguing, and so we want to do those closer to the end of the microcycle, maybe right before they're going to get a day off, so that way they'll be really tired going into a rest day. They'll have the ability to recover and regenerate, and then they'll come back fresh after a day or two, and we can do more tactical and technical training on the next microcycle. So the gist of it here is you want to use the same concepts in terms of the order of, I was going to say biomotor abilities, but that's not really right, kind of, because that doesn't include tactical or technical training. So you're going to want to use the same basic order of training goals across the week as you do in an individual workout, I guess is the takeaway there. So in terms of constructing the microcycle or the training week, one of the things to keep in mind is that you don't have to change the workout every single week. So you can use the same microcycle 2 to 3 times during a particular macrocycle. So, because remember, we've talked previously that you maximize adaptations to a particular stimulus at about 4 weeks. It may be a little bit less than that, maybe a little closer to 2, but because it'll take 2 to 4 weeks to maximize adaptations to a particular stimulus, you can repeat that stimulus a couple times. So you don't have to come up with these really new innovative workouts every single week. You can do the same workout for 2 weeks in a row, or maybe you can do, workout A, or microcycle A, microcycle B, and then go back to A the following week. So you could do something like that as well. But in general, it's kind of at least the way that I conceptualize it, tends to be a little bit more linear. So it would be microcycle A, B, that kind of a thing. So the workouts are changing every 2 weeks rather than every week. So that's one of the things to think about. So there can be some repetition. The other thing is that obviously the intensity is going to vary across the training week, so across the microcycle. So typically you don't want to have more than 2 to 3 very hard days in the microcycle. You don't want to have more than 2 to 3 days where they're going to absolute failure, because that's both physically and mentally, not fentally, the word I just made up, both physically and mentally fatiguing. So one of the things you'll see, like even with cross-country runners, for example, oftentimes they'll train 5, 6, maybe sometimes 7 days a week, but they'll only engage in 2 to 3 quality days or 2 to 3 hard days. So they'll have 2 to 3 really intense workouts, and they want to be fresh for those workouts, but the rest of the time is much lower intensity, and so it doesn't take as much mental energy, doesn't take as much physical energy. So just something to be aware of, that you're not going to go, absolutely all out 5 days a week or 5 workouts a week, unless you're talking about a really elite athlete, and even then you're probably pushing closer to overreaching and potentially overtraining if we do that for too long. So in terms of structuring the microcycle, so factors to consider. So the first one there, the objective. So what is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to keep them, like, I was thinking of a competition microcycle. We're trying to allow them to hang on to their aerobic capacity, trying to allow them to hang on to their strength, or trying to teach them new things. And so obviously whatever it is the focus of the cycle should come right after a rest day or right after a deload day, because then they're the freshest, again, both physically and mentally. And so we want to structure those things right after they take a break. Obviously we want to, and this goes in with that, what training demand are we targeting with this particular workout? So we're trying to, do high volume stuff with lots and lots of sessions. Are we trying to increase the complexity of the workouts, with complexity, that might be tactical or technical elements as well. So like an increasingly complex workout would include, so something like gymnastics, and I am out of my element on this, but if you're doing something like gymnastics, you're adding new things to the routine. You're obviously increasing the complexity of that individual workout or that individual session. And so again, we're going to do those more complex things, I was going to say earlier in the cycle, but not necessarily that. You're going to do the more complex things after a day off or a deload day. Talked about intensity fluctuations. Obviously, if you're going to plan the training week, you want to think how you're going to go about inducing those training adaptations. So, are you trying to increase their strength? And so then are you going to use like basic barbell lifts? Are you trying to increase their balance or increase their agility? And so what are the actual like drills you're going to use for that? And obviously the timing of the competitions is going to be a big factor. So if we're doing this during the competitive part of the annual plan, then when they compete is going to very much structure how we do the rest of the week. So just as we start with the full annual plan and work our way down, in this case, when we're planning out a training week, we're going to start out with, we got a competition Wednesday, we have another one on Friday, and so this is how we're going to structure the week. We build everything around that. Especially if you are engaged in sports that only have relatively few competitions, so they're not competing like baseballs every day, softballs every few days, potentially multiple games a day. But if you've got sports that only compete once a week, or maybe they only have tournaments every few weeks or meets every few weeks, then you want to do the highest intensity sessions 3 to 5 days before the competition. And that way they can deload a little bit, recover a little bit, and then be ready to go for the big competition. So in terms of classifying microcycles, you can classify them based on the number of sessions. Your more novice athletes will do fewer sessions per week. So like youth sports athletes, middle school and below, probably train 2 to 3 times a week. And then as they move on in their athletic career, as they move on and gain experience, they can tolerate higher loads, and more specifically higher volumes. And so then we can add in days per week. So you can have them, in this case, they're doing 5 days a week, and then build up, and maybe they're doing multiple things a day. Now again, so here, that figure 7.4, the last picture I added on there. So there you've got 8 sessions per week, but in that, they're doing multiple sessions per day, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are lifting weights twice a day, or that doesn't necessarily mean that they're running twice a day. That morning training session could be something like a film session, or maybe that morning training session is really intense strength training, speed endurance, and then in the afternoon we're doing film study, that kind of stuff. Now, the way I just described that, we would have done something really fatiguing early on, and then we would have done something that requires mental energy after that. So that may or may not be the best plan, but that kind of goes in with the individualization of the program, of what works best for your athletes and what works best for you and the schedule that you have. Because the authors of this book have worked with pretty elite level athletes, like Bompa, in going back and reading his bio, worked with international level athletes, and so then they can do things like this, figure 7.7 that I just added, where they've got 5 consecutive training sessions. They do have 1 day a week off, but that's lots and lots of training. And so if you're working with international level athletes, you can do that. If you're working with high school level athletes, you probably get 3, maybe 4 training sessions a week. So now again, it might be more if you're doing some film study stuff in there, some chalk talk stuff in there, but these really high volume things, or not volume, this is high frequency, these really high frequency things you tend to see with more elite athletes. And if you have all the time in the world and an elite athlete, you can do things like this. So again, within the workout, you want the high power, I was going to say like high velocity, high power, same thing, fast type movements. You want those in the morning, and then, or the agile or the agility or the unbalanced type training, you also want that pretty early on. So you can see here where they're doing, like on Monday, plyometric training first thing in the morning, and then they're doing their sprint training after that, and then strength training at the end. So that's that basic order we talked about with planning an individual workout, and so then that has been applied here to the actual microcycle. The other thing that they're doing is then they're doing a different training stimulus. So this would probably be something fairly early in the preparatory phase. And this workout, I don't remember what it's for, but I would guess, based on the structure, it's probably for one of those interval sprint type athletes, basketball, soccer, etc. Because you've got all of your, jump type training here, and then we're working on being fast, and then we're doing strength training, which contributes to being fast, and then also contributes to our ability to contributes to our stretch shortening cycle, so the muscles can lengthen really quickly and bounce back really quickly. So all these things feed into each other, and then we'll do our aerobic training to increase our aerobic capacity. But that's because that is probably lower intensity and longer duration, the way they've set it up here. That is not exactly a recovery day, but pretty close, right? And so you kind of get those between. So that'll allow for recovery there. Again, we want to vary the intensity across the week, and you can have 1 to 3 high demand training days, which I think I even used their wording there, but then on the graphic that goes with it, they actually have 2 very high demand days and then 2 high demand days. But let's say, plan on 3 days of 80% or more of their 1 rep max, or 80% or more of their total training load, or their, not total, 80% or more of their peak training load, 3 days a week. Because otherwise, again, you're going to hit overreaching and eventually overtraining. To go back to this, so you've seen this chart before. It's table 7.1, but we've used it, or it's popped up in previous chapters. It's the same one in terms of, again, my anchor point is always strength training. So very high intensity stuff, 90% or more of your 1 rep max. So weights you can lift, 3 times or less. Now we're kind of in that like 5 to 3 range down here, 8 to 5 range in here, that kind of thing. So then how that applies here is that we could be doing pretty close to maximal weights twice a week, sets of 5, twice a week, and then down here we're doing 10s and 12s, lighter stuff, lower intensity stuff. And one of the other things they could be doing on these days, I forget what they call it. I think they call it compensation work in this chapter, but you could be doing things to work on like stabilizing muscles, again using my anchor point of strength training. So if you've got different change of direction athletes, so again my go-tos, soccer, hockey, basketball, etc., you could have them doing like hip stabilization stuff, you could have them doing scapular stabilization stuff, core stuff. You could have them doing that on these lower load days, and then they're doing the big movements, squats and snatches and that kind of stuff here, or probably like snatches and cleans here, and then squats or deadlifts or whatever in here. Doesn't have to be in that order. It always looks nice to incrementally increase. And again, I have a very linear way of thinking, but it doesn't always have to go that way. You can mix it up a little bit more than that. So you could have more of an undulating periodization as well. So this is, as you can see, figure 7.17. And so this is a multi-workout, multi-session microcycle is probably a better way of saying that. So you can see this javelin thrower is going to work out between 10 and 11 in the morning, and then again between 4 and 6 o'clock in the evening. And so what she's doing are, she's got some short sprints here, and then throws, and then similar kind of a thing here. Doesn't exactly have throws in there. There's our throws are on Thursday, Tuesday and Thursday. And so the really high quality work they're having her do first thing in the morning, and then in the afternoon is more of the volume type work. So you can see that here. And then you've got here at the basketball game trying to, it's interesting, 2 by 15 minutes. But the gist of it there is they're trying to work on that ATP phosphocreatine, the glycolytic system, getting some change of direction stuff in there. So there's the idea with throwing the basketball game on there was to train some of those energy systems and train similar-ish movements, but mostly the energy systems that she's going to use in her event, but in a different way. So it's not just throwing, it's not just performing the basic movements all the time. It is doing it in a little bit more novel way to hopefully keep the athlete more interested. Which this one's an interesting one. So the fact that she would compete, let's say at a track meet here, first thing in the morning and then play a basketball game that afternoon. I don't know about that training plan, but it's an interesting idea. All right, so we talked about this stuff actually on the opening slide. So here's the different types of microcycles. So remember, the developmental one is one that we're going to see in the preparatory phase. So the idea there, as you can see, is to increase adaptations. So again, those biomotor abilities. So we're trying to increase muscular size, strength, power, etc. Trying to improve their technical abilities, so improve their skills, and then develop particular biomotor abilities. So maybe we're addressing the fact that they lack muscular endurance, or something specific to this athlete that we need to make sure that we spend extra time on is something that you can do during one of these preparatory phases. And so what you can see here is these are basically training days, these developmental days. So we're trying to induce whatever the adaptation is, and then we give them a rest day, which is still a workout day, but it's a rest day of sorts. So lower training load there. And then we go back into it, trying to foster or develop some adaptations. So providing pretty strong training stimulus here, and then a deload day, and then a full recovery day on Sunday. So they're actually getting a full day off there, which I'm not sure 100% why this is not down here, but that's okay. So again, that idea of varying the training load across the week. And remember that training load in that sense refers to that combination of volume, intensity, and frequency. Talked about the recovery or regeneration microcycle. So the idea there is to dissipate residual fatigue. So across the course of multiple microcycles in a row, they will be increasingly fatigued. And so we will have one like this, where we're at the end of the preparatory phase, for example, right before they start competition, and then we'll allow them to deload a little bit, come back more physically and mentally fresh, and so then we can start a whole new training cycle at in the early competitive phase. and I mentioned this earlier, you can change the modalities a little bit. So you can, have your swimmer over there doing some cycling, upper body bike, or upper body ergometer, that kind of stuff. Or like the javelin thrower a second ago, playing basketball. In the peaking or unloading one, so again, and you see this more so with sports like swimming or more endurance type sports where they only have a handful of meets per year, where the athlete is going to maintain the intensity, so keep lifting as heavy weight, keep swimming as fast, but decrease the volume, so reduce the number of repetitions, reduce the number of sets that they do. And then if we move on to the competitive phase here, so again, we're going to start with when do the athletes compete and then build our training cycle around that. So this particular athlete competes once a week on Saturdays. So maybe they're like a soccer player, so but not a collegiate one, pro soccer player. So they're going to compete, all out apparently on competition day, which is great. So they're going to go all out on Saturday. Sunday is a rest day. And then Monday is a regeneration day. So maybe on Monday they're doing, film study, they're doing foam rolling and stretching and some of those compensation exercises. Again, like hip rotator strengthening, maybe some ACL prevention type stuff on those days. Then we're going to do, here with our technical training, we're going to work on their shot, right? And then, or dribbling or whatever it is that we need to have them work on. And then in addition to that, once we're done with the technical stuff, then we have them doing lifting weights. Maybe this day we have them doing lifting weights and sprinting, and then we're going to unload going into that once a week competition. So now here we have reduced or eliminated the strength training either these days, only a handful of sprints here, and then again, maybe we're incorporating some of the foam rolling, the stretching, and then film review kind of stuff. Have them doing walkthroughs, that sort of thing. And then they're ready for the competition. Here, they got 2 competitions a week. So you see this type of thing is pretty common with a lot of high school sports. So if we're thinking about things like soccer, like basketball, often they'll play, like Tuesday, Friday kind of a thing. Volleyball often has a similar schedule. And you see that also with like collegiate basketball as well, where they'll do something like Wednesday, Friday, or Wednesday, Saturday, something to that effect. With this weird year, I don't remember how often like our basketball teams play, but I do vaguely recall it's about twice a week, Wednesday, Saturday, or something to that effect. So this type of setup would mimic that. So we'll start out with a regeneration day. Again, maybe coming in to these or coming off of a game here on this regeneration day. Again, we're having them do foam rolling, stretching, all that stuff. But we're introducing new tactics. So, here's the 2 teams we're playing this week, or here's the most immediate team that we're playing on Wednesday. Here are the ways that we're going to attack their defense. Here's what their defense looks like. Here are the ways we're going to defend them, that kind of stuff. So more of a high mental load that day, less of a physical load. Then we're going to just do tactical training, get ready for the competition. And so one of the things you can see here, though, is and we've talked about this a little bit before, where when we have the athletes do strength training, during the season, that may be only 1 to 3 times a week. And so with this setup, they're probably only lifting here on Friday. And then they're probably doing some conditioning here, have them take a much lighter load on Saturday so they can be ready for the competition on Sunday in this case. Here you got somebody that competes back-to-back. Maybe this is a tournament. Maybe they're playing multiple games over the course of a weekend, that kind of thing. So in that case, we want their heaviest load to be, again, 3 to 5 days out. So in this case, it's 4 days out, where we're going to have them do most of their high-intensity strength training, their sprints, that kind of stuff, and then we'll have them reduce the load for the remainder of the week so that they're fresh for the competition. In terms of quantifying the training, we've talked about this a little bit before. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it, and it's dependent upon the demands of the sport. So that could be with your endurance athletes, maybe that's meters rowed because this is a rowing one. Maybe that is miles run or cycled or whatever. And so the way that they're doing zones of intensity here are based on a combination of things like your heart rate and then also your stroke rate. So the faster they row, obviously the harder they're working, and so they're going to have a higher heart rate. One of the things you see down here that I would call your attention to is that the vast majority of the training is kind of in this zone. So if we're down here, that is moderate to mild intensity exercise, and so that's not really going to foster any adaptations, or at least not for our athletes. There's some health benefits to be had there, but not really going to help our athletes very much. So we're working at a little higher intensity here, but not maximal intensity for more than about 10% of the week. So again, you only have 1 to 3, but probably 2 to 3 really high load quality workouts per week, and that's reflected here in the fact that that's only 10% of the week is spent at that highest intensity zone. This one, so for your team sports, so again, things like basketball here, and they're also quantifying it by heart rate, but they're doing it between, we're also incorporating like how long they're working out. So longer sprints here, a little shorter sprints here, and then altering the rest intervals. One of the things with this particular chart or figure that bugs me is that, so this one is related to, or they're trying to scheme out, like here are the workouts they're doing, right? So here's a morning workout, here's an afternoon workout. So they're doing a ton of workouts in a row. But what they're trying to do here is to match that to this theoretical fatigue curve. But the thing that drives me crazy is that as the curve goes down, what they're trying to indicate is that the athlete is more fatigued. So you think if the fatigue curve goes down, they're less fatigued, that's good. That's actually not the way this thing is drawn up. So as this fatigue curve goes down, that's how the athlete's increasingly tired. So they're worn out down here. So, Monday morning, coming off of a day off, they did technical stuff, working on learning to throw a new pitch or something to that effect. Then we did strength training, so they're pretty fatigued, but they only had one really physically taxing session there, so they're able to come back pretty quickly, do high intensity speed stuff, power or endurance stuff. That's a lot harder physically, so they're more fatigued on Wednesday. Your tempo stuff, what you're going to see here on Wednesday, what this is trying to depict is an incomplete recovery. So they're not back to zero. And as you can imagine, with this many workouts per week, that would be expected, that they're not going to be fully recovered there. So tempo training we've talked about previously, that would be, again, those runs of like 20 to 30 minutes between 88 and 92% of your heart rate max. It doesn't have to be running, but it's just some kind of an activity like that. So not all out, but it's uncomfortable is basically the way that that's set up. And then in the afternoon, to get a little bit of physical recovery, they're going to do some tactical stuff. Technical stuff here, so these two are just mostly mentally taxing, and so they're going to have a chance to recover. Then we do our strength stuff again down here, and then we work, because these tend to be low volume, our speed and power stuff. And then again, back to tempo, tactical, and then our power endurance. This one also depicts that they're not fully recovering, and so this one has that compensation training that I mentioned. So again, like injury prevention type stuff, and that includes like rotator cuff strengthening, core work, hip strengthening, glute strengthening would fall under that compensation training. But that's a way that they're doing something productive, but that's also not particularly fatiguing. And so that compensation training can play a really important role in allowing them to recover physically and mentally, but also then be prepared to go. It'll enable them to be more efficient and effective at their sport. Going on to macro cycles instead of micros. Remember, these are 2 to 6 weeks. And so you can see that step loading that we've talked about previously. So here's a 4-1. So we're increasing the load across 4 weeks. We have an unload cycle here, and then we go back to a 3-1. And so something like that step loading would be pretty common for the preparatory phase. And then in this one for the competitive phase, what you've got here, so the competition days, again, this is probably, let's say Sunday, this is Saturday, maybe it's an athlete that has a weekend tournament, a little lower load here, and then we're getting all the real work done kind of middle of the week, take a day off or deload pretty significantly, and then they're ready to go again. So again, only 1 to 3 sessions that are pretty high intensity. And really here, they've got 2, so one at very high and one at high. Let's call this Wednesday, Thursday of the training week. Take Friday off, and then Saturday. So we talked about unloading and tapering. So there are the key numbers there. So somewhere between a 40 and 60% drop in volume. And then the taper is typically 1 to 2 microcycles, so somewhere between 8 and 14 days. And that is it. So that's all of chapter 7. So chapter 8 next time is this really monstrous chapter about designing the annual plan. I think it's the longest chapter in the book, but so much of it we've covered up to this point that I think it'll actually be pretty quick. So we'll see you next time for chapter 8.